Okay, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are plunging into a topic that is both vital and, frankly, pretty perplexing.
Mm,
Foreign aid. We've been digging into some fascinating source material, particularly an article that really gets to the heart of a central paradox here.
it really does. And the numbers on this paradox are, well, they're truly staggering when you look at them. We're talking about Western nations spending hundreds of billions of dollars every single year, aiming to help poorer countries develop.
Hundreds of billions, with a B, year after year. And yet, despite this massive investment, we still see, what, 692 million people living in extreme poverty globally?
Exactly. And what's maybe even more concerning is that in some regions that number isn't shrinking. It's actually going up.
Right. It really makes you stop and think about the results, doesn't it?
It forces you to, especially when you look at some of the historical comparisons in the material. You've got countries that achieved remarkable development, like China, like Indonesia.
Mm.
Well, they actually received relatively little foreign aid during their key growth periods.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
then you contrast that with nations like, say, Malawi, Kenya, or the DRC countries that have been major recipients, getting substantial aid for decades, and their economies are still, well, stubbornly stagnant.
Mm.
So this huge effort, this enormous amount of money, why isn't it consistently translating into broad, sustainable progress?
Mm-hmm.
That's really our mission today, to deep dive into this material, unpack these complexities, understand the criticisms, and try to figure out what's really going on.
And I think it's key right at the start to clarify what kind of aid we're focusing on here, because it's not all the same.
Good point.
We're looking specifically at development aid. This is the long-term stuff, the money, the goods, the expertise that's meant to build infrastructure, systems, capacity for lasting change.
Okay.
It's different from humanitarian aid, which is absolutely critical, of course, but that's more short-term, responding to crises, emergencies, famines.
Got it. So development aid, that's the focus. The theory behind that, then, is it's supposed to help poor countries escape what's often called the low-income equilibrium trap. Is that right?
That's the idea. Yeah, that trap is this kind of vicious cycle where a country just doesn't generate enough wealth to save much.
Uh-huh.
And if they don't save enough, they can't invest enough. Without investment, they can't really grow the economy to generate more wealth in the future. It's like the analogy in the source is like trying to start a car with a completely dead battery.
Ah, okay.
Aid is meant to be that jump start, that initial injection of capital or expertise to get the engine turning over.
Okay, but if that's the big idea, where is it falling short? Now, we should say the analysis points out aid hasn't been a complete failure,
Okay.
right? It has helped reduce poverty in certain places.
Oh, absolutely. And quite dramatically in some cases. If you look at countries like Vietnam, Rwanda, Ethiopia, they've seen significant drops in poverty rates. And aid, especially when it's focused on things like health initiatives or food security, has played a real role. It saves lives, improves well-being in specific areas, no question.
There's a but coming, I feel.
Well, here's the critical distinction raised by the analysis. While aid can reduce poverty in those targeted ways, it has largely failed to significantly boost overall broad-based economic growth across the board.
And that's the key for long-term sustainability, isn't it? Getting the whole economy moving.
Yeah.
Is there solid evidence for that lack of growth impact?
There is. Listen to this finding. A major review back in 2010, it looked at over 100 studies on aid and growth. And it found virtually no significant correlation between the amount of foreign aid received and GDP growth.
Wow. None. That's pretty damning.
It really makes you wonder, if aid isn't reliably fueling growth, why not? And one major factor pointed out is how aid can sometimes actually replace or undermine domestic industry.
How does that work? How can something meant to help end up hurting local businesses?
Well, think about goods that come in as subsidized aid, like massive imports of secondhand clothing, for instance, or even free or heavily subsidized fertilizers.
Okay.
While they might provide immediate relief or seem helpful, they directly compete with local businesses trying to make and sell similar things. And often the local producers just can't compete on price.
Right.
There's that powerful example discussed of the African apparel industry. It was significantly damaged, effectively collapsed in many places, under the pressure of these cheap secondhand clothing imports that arrived as aid or charity.
So the aid, even with the best intentions, can accidentally wipe out the very economic activity needed for jobs and independent growth. That's a terrible unintended consequence.
It is. And it connects to another issue raised, These missed opportunities for building local capacity, local skills. Well, often donor countries or the organizations they fund bring in their own experts, their own contractors, sometimes even their own labor for projects, instead of prioritizing the training and employment of local people.
You mean like for big infrastructure projects, building roads or dams?
Exactly that kind of thing. If foreign firms, the analysis mentions instances with, say, Chinese firms building infrastructure, if they bring in all their own engineers, project managers, construction crews, well, the local workforce doesn't gain that crucial experience, those skills, the knowledge transfer needed.
Ah,
So they don't learn how to build their own industries and infrastructure in the future. It just perpetuates a cycle of dependency.
okay, let's shift gears slightly. The article flags something else, calls it phantom aid, and talks about problems with how the money actually flows, or maybe how it gets stuck.
Yeah, the structure is described as incredibly top-heavy and bureaucratic. A huge chunk of the money officially designated as aid never actually reaches the frontline organizations, the local groups working directly with communities on the ground.
How much are we talking?
There's a really striking statistic mentioned. In 2024, apparently only about 12% of U.S. aid funding went directly to those local frontline development organizations.
12%, only 12. So, I mean, where's the other 88% going? That's huge.
Well, much of it stays within the donor country itself, or it goes to large Western consulting firms, big international NGOs, contractors based in the West. This is a big part of what gets labeled phantom aid.
Okay.
It's money that's counted as aid on the books, but it's spent on administration, consultants, technical assistance provided by donor country firms, or goods and services bought from the donor country. It doesn't directly empower local actors or necessarily reach the intended beneficiaries on the ground.
And I guess that connects directly to the bureaucracy and the incentives involved, right?
Absolutely. The sheer amount of paperwork, risk assessments, reporting, compliance frameworks, it's staggering, and often it feels quite disconnected from achieving tangible results for people in poverty.
Hmm.
And here's a critical point from the analysis. A huge percentage, something like 98% of USAID grants, for instance, are not results-based.
Not results-based. What does that actually mean in practice? Like, how does it play out?
It means organizations, the contractors, the NGOs, they often get paid based on completing activities, submitting reports, ticking boxes, not based on proving they've actually, say, reduced child mortality by X% or helped Y number of farmers increase yields sustainably or built a local enterprise that's now thriving.
So they get paid for the process, not the outcome.
Pretty much. Paid for inputs and activities rather than for the impact they achieve.
Ah, okay, that sounds exactly like what economists call a principal-agent problem. The principals, the donors, ultimately taxpayers like you and me, want poverty reduction.
But
the agents delivering the aid, the big contractors, they have different incentives if their pay isn't tied to that outcome.
precisely. If your compensation isn't directly linked to achieving genuine poverty reduction or fostering growth, then your incentive might become, well, maximizing your billable hours, fulfilling the contract requirements, navigating the bureaucracy successfully.
Yeah.
The focus can shift away from effectiveness on the ground towards just operational compliance and keeping the contracts flowing, perpetuating the system itself in a way.
So given all these deep-seated issues, are there alternatives being looked at? The article mentions direct cash transfers briefly.
Yeah, cash transfers, they've definitely gotten a lot of attention. And there are different types, right? You have conditional ones where
Yeah.
people get the money if they do certain things, like send their kids to school or get vaccinations. Brazil's Bolsa Familia is a famous example. And then you have unconditional cash transfers where people just get the money, no strings attached. Both have shown some promise. They get money directly into the hands of poor people who, let's face it, often know best what they need most urgently.
And they have shown success, at least in the short term, for alleviating immediate hardship.
Yes, they can provide a quick boost, help families buy food, medicine, pay school fees, maybe make small investments in a tiny business. They definitely can reduce immediate suffering.
Another but.
But the analysis notes a crucial limitation here, too. Their positive effects tend to fade within a few years after the transfers stop. So, while they can be great for immediate relief and smoothing consumption,
Right.
they don't, on their own, seem to generate that sustained long-term economic growth that really lifts entire communities out of that low-income trap we talked about. It's not the engine starter, maybe just a temporary fuel boost.
Okay. Now, look, we can't really talk about foreign aid without the issue of corruption coming up. It's always cited as a major reason aid fails.
Yeah.
How does the source material handle that?
It acknowledges it, absolutely. Corruption is a factor. There was a World Bank study, I think from 2020, cited in the material, that found evidence suggesting anywhere from 7% to maybe 12% of certain types of aid funds could be diverted to offshore accounts in heavily aid-reliant countries.
7 to 12% leakage. That feels like a massive drain on resources meant for the poor.
It is a significant amount of money, no doubt. But the analysis also presents a more nuanced view on corruption's overall impact. It points out that aid's effect is actually mixed. Some studies even suggest that certain kinds of aid might help reduce certain types of corruption.
Oh, really? How?
Maybe by increasing transparency requirements or funding specific anti-corruption initiatives or supporting independent judiciaries. So it's not a simple one-way street where aid always equals more corruption. The picture is more complicated.
Okay, so leakage is definitely a problem, but the overall effect on corruption levels might be mixed or even positive in some cases. So what does the analysis suggest is the more concerning outcome, maybe, regarding governance and institutions?
This is a really critical point raised. In states with weak institutions, a heavy reliance on foreign aid can actually reduce the government's incentive to build its own strong, effective domestic tax system.
Why bother taxing your own people if the money flows in from donors?
Exactly. If you're getting a huge chunk of your national budget from external sources, why go through the politically difficult, administratively complex work of setting up efficient tax collection from your own citizens and businesses?
Right.
And here's the really crucial consequence. When a government isn't reliant on taxing its own citizens, it tends to become less accountable to those citizens. The whole social contract shifts. The government ends up answering more to the donors and their requirements than to the needs and demands of its own population. That link, that accountability, gets weakened.
That's a profound impact.
Yeah.
Shifting who the government feels it primarily serves. And I suppose this all ties into the geopolitical dimension, too. Aid is never purely altruistic, is it? There are always foreign policy goals mixed in.
Oh, absolutely. Aid serves foreign policy objectives, it builds influence, it acts as a form of soft power for donor nations. That's always been part of the calculation. And what we're seeing now, according to the analysis, is a really significant global shift.
How so?
As traditional Western aid budgets face cuts, the material mentions one example, I think, of a potential 90% cut in certain U.S. aid areas. Other global powers are stepping into that space.
You mean countries like China, Russia?
Exactly. They are increasing their presence, their influence through, big infrastructure investments, resource deals, other forms of state-backed finance that might look different from traditional Western aid but serve similar geopolitical goals.
And what are the implications of that shift?
Well, it's not just about changing who writes the checks. It has the potential to really reshape global alliances, to influence political systems in developing countries, and to shift the overall balance of power, particularly across Africa and other developing regions where this competition for influence is playing out.
So, looking ahead then, slashed aid budgets from traditional donors, that sounds pretty bleak initially. You think about the potential impact. Millions potentially at risk, right?
It's a very real danger, yes. There are serious humanitarian implications if funding for essential services is cut drastically. That needs to be acknowledged up front. However, the analysis also presents this really challenging situation as potentially, maybe paradoxically, creating an unexpected opportunity for some positive changes. The kind of changes, perhaps, that the traditional aid model actually struggled to foster.
An opportunity born out of crisis. How does that work?
Well, think about it. If countries can no longer rely quite so heavily on that external funding stream, maybe, just maybe, it provides the necessary catalyst for them to finally build those stronger domestic tax systems we talked about.
Okay.
It could force governments, out of necessity, to become more responsive and accountable to their own citizens, because that's where the revenue needs to come from. It could strengthen that social contract.
Right.
And perhaps it might even create more space for local industries to finally compete and grow without being constantly undercut by subsidized aid imports. It could be a chance for a fundamental rebalancing.
That would be a huge shift. So if we try and distill the core insights from all this material we've dug into, foreign aid is clearly not a complete failure.
No, absolutely not. Let's be clear on that. It has achieved remarkable humanitarian successes. It's saved countless lives through health programs, famine relief, crisis response. It's not something to just write off entirely.
Okay.
But It is also clearly not the silver bullet for achieving long-term, self-sustaining economic growth that maybe many hoped or assumed it would be.
And its struggle with fostering that deeper, lasting growth comes down to several key factors we've discussed.
Right, things like fundamental design flaws in how it's delivered,
Mm.
that suffocating bureaucracy we mentioned, the tendency to create dependency rather than self-reliance, and the fact that it often operates within countries that already have significant institutional weaknesses. It doesn't fix those underlying issues easily.
So the analysis seems to point towards a future for aid, if it's going to be truly effective, that needs to look very different from the past.
Yes, definitely. A future that really demands results-based funding paying for proven impact, not just ticking boxes. A future that needs to genuinely empower local organizations, the ones on the ground.
Mm.
It needs to truly prioritize long-term skill building and knowledge transfer, not just bring in temporary foreign expertise. And maybe most importantly, focus on supporting good governance and helping countries build their own robust domestic resource mobilization, helping them stand on their own feet, essentially.
It really is a hugely complex picture, isn't it? You've got this system, born largely of good intentions, with these undeniable life-saving successes in some areas,
Right.
but also riddled with these fundamental structural flaws, these perverse incentives, and these unintended consequences that have really hindered its ability to deliver transformative, sustainable development for the vast majority of the billions and billions spent over the decades.
Absolutely sums it up. And as we watch this global power landscape shift, with traditional Western donors perhaps pulling back and others stepping in, it really leaves us and you listening with a powerful question to consider. What does a truly effective and sustainable approach to supporting development actually look like in this new era? And perhaps even more importantly, who should be leading that effort moving forward? Is it governments? Is it the private sector? Is it local communities themselves? Or some new combination?
Definitely something to really mull over.
Uh-huh.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the paradoxes and problems of foreign aid.
My pleasure. Fascinating topic.